Dave Roland wrote a piece of legislation, and we talked about this on the Gun Show on Saturday. He wrote this legislation that said no state or local law enforcement agent can enforce federal anti-gun laws. In other words, if the federal government wants to come and enforce it, they have to do it themselves.
Okay.
Which would be virtually impossible. It would be quite challenging. And the Republicans passed it in the House, and they passed it in the Senate, and they sent it to Nixon, and he vetoed it.
Yep.
So it went back to the House, and they voted, and it was a substantial enough vote to override the veto, and they sent it to the Senate. And the Senate, a couple of Republicans got wishy-washy, and they missed the override by one vote.
That's frustrating.
Otherwise, it would have been enacted, and apparently they're pushing that law again.
Hopefully they get it through, because now we have Governor Parson who would
probably sign it.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
You know, the funny thing is California was pushing for a similar law because of the rampant abuse of civil asset forfeiture reform. That's the first I'd heard of statutes like that being to try to restrict, because the feds dangle in front of these local law enforcement agencies. Look, okay, so your state said you can't do this, but you can do it through us, and we'll just give you the money. And like we had that famous quote from former Chief Burton saying it's like pennies from heaven, because it kind of is. It's arbitrary, like, are we going to get something or not? But the feds are really getting their tentacles into our local law enforcement agencies. You go down to federal court, and they're sitting there at council table with the federal prosecutors. They're like working for them part-time. The feds are using their money to really start controlling our local law enforcement agencies, and nobody's talking about it.
Well, that's something that is an issue, because we are losing control of our constitutional republic. Yep. Let me go to the phones here. Chris, welcome. Glad to have you on the Gary Nolan Show.
I want to talk about the Dave Roland and the law and the state people can't do this. And you were touching on what I was going to go for, Jennifer, is that the feds have come in and they deputize with either a U.S. Marshal, an ATF agent, a whatever, almost every police department, sheriff's department. So I'm thinking this law they're talking about, you won't actually have the local law enforcement do anything. They'll just have that deputy charge you with the crime because he's a federal officer on paper, even though he is your local law enforcement. And I think that's going to be their loophole to get around it unless they write it into the law.
Yeah, it will be for crimes. Well, I guess, yeah, that's something that Dave Roland could speak to better than I could as to whether his statute that he's written would address that loophole.
Right, because they do that almost everywhere. They got one person on task force on practically every police department, sheriff's department.
They do.
So that's where
they won't be. They won't be able to be a local law enforcement agent at the same time. You can't
under that statute, because right now they are. They're wearing two hats.
Well,
this is exactly.
This is supposed to prevent them, if they're a local law enforcement. You can try and compartmentalize all day long. They are local law enforcement.
Yeah, but I mean, if they're also deputized as the federal, they can just say, well, I was doing that in my capacity as federal.
All right, the gauntlet has been tossed. Chris, thank you for the call. Brian, can you call Dave Roland, see if he's got a few minutes to spend with us?
I can do that.
All right, we'll see if we can get Dave Roland on between now and like 3.5 minutes from now. You're listening to the Gary Nolan Show. Jennifer Bukowski, our guest on the Zimmer Radio Network. All right. I got just about 3 minutes. What a blessing here. I got two of my favorite attorneys on the air at the same time. In addition to Jennifer Bukowski, we now have Dave Roland. Dave, welcome. How are you?
Doing all right, Gary. You lived a charmed life to have two of these attorneys on the phone at the same time.
Don't push it. Just telling you, don't push it. Listen, you wrote a piece of legislation. We were talking about this. We talked about it on the Gun Show Saturday morning, and I brought it up here with Jennifer, that says essentially, what, Brian? That essentially state and local law enforcement can't enforce federal anti-gun laws.
Yes.
And somebody said, well, a lot of times you'll have a local law enforcement officer who's also a federal employee, federal agent.
Will they be able to do that?
That does happen, and it's a problem, yes.
Under your legislation, will they be able to do the civil asset forfeiture if they've been deputized or whatever by the feds?
The Second Amendment Preservation Act would not expressly prohibit the use of civil asset forfeiture generally, but it would probably prevent its use in firearms-related cases because it should prevent the local officials from assisting with the enforcement of federal gun laws.
Even if they're working for the feds?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
good.
Good. So just because someone agrees to enter into a partnership with the feds for certain purposes, it doesn't mean that they have to engage in a partnership for all purposes. And so effectively what the legislation would require is if someone is kind of a dual agent, working both for state or local law enforcement and for the federal government, they would need to modify the agreement under which they work for the government, the federal government, rather. So basically, you just have to shift what the current agreement is so that it would no longer include using the state and local law enforcement to assist in the enforcement of the federal federal gun laws.
Dave Roland, mofreedom.org. Mofreedom.org.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, David.
Sure, not a problem, y'all.
All right, buddy. Take care. Dave Roland, mofreedom.org.